Good afternoon, I guess I should say good evening. Thanks for coming out in this weather, although I guess it's now the sun has come out. So it is my pleasure to welcome Darren Walker, who's the current president of the Ford Foundation, for a conversation with our treasured professor, Stanley Katz, who is also our specialist here at the Woodrow Wilson School on philanthropy and nonprofits and director of the Center for Arts and Cultural Policy Studies. So Darren grew up in Ames, a town of 1,800 people in East Texas in a low-income single-parent household. When he was 5, a woman working on the education front of President Johnson's war on poverty knocked on their door and invited Darren's mother to enroll him in a nearby preschool. Darren told staff as he accepted his appointment as president in 2013, "It was not until years later that I learned that the idea for this particular program was funded with an investment from the Ford Foundation. The program was called Head Start, and it gave me mine." Darren went through Texas public schools to the University of Texas, earning a BA in government, a BS in speech communication, and his Juris Doctor from their law school, funded in part by Pell Grants, another initiative championed by the Ford Foundation. While working for a Wall Street law firm and investment bank, he realized it wasn't finance but philanthropy that beckoned him to New York. He went from working with a local community in Harlem on an economic development initiative as the CEO of a not-for-profit, Abyssinian Development Corporation, to eventually becoming vice president of the Rockefeller Foundation and then vice president of the Ford Foundation before assuming his current post. But Darren so often tells his story, as he says, not because it is unique, but it's because it is not unique. He has come to his post of president emphasizing the significance of the work it has in the world, in enforcing an awareness of the relationship between philanthropy and social justice and innovation. At the Woodrow Wilson School, we strive for an understanding of this relationship and the role philanthropy plays in development domestically and internationally. Please join me in welcoming Darren Walker for this discussion on philanthropy.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Well, thanks to Dean Rouse, and thank all of you for coming. It's a wonderful audience today. It's a great opportunity to speak with Darren Walker. As Cece said, I've been studying philanthropy for a long time now, and one of the things we're going to talk about is the ways in which this field has changed over the years. I've been studying the field since the early 1970s, and as it happens, that's really the period in which there's been profound transformation of this field. I pulled up the other day the list of the largest foundations in the United States by net assets, and if I look, the largest, nobody's going to be surprised, is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which had, this is 2013 numbers, a little bit over $41 billion. It's more like $43 billion now, I think. The number 2 in 2013 was the Ford Foundation with $12.3 billion. But what's more interesting, I think, than anything else is 2 facts. One is that the Rockefeller Foundation is now number 15. When I started to study this, it was number 1. So those relationships have changed quite a lot. But much more important, I would say, that if you look at those foundations that have assets of $1 billion or more, this is what I call a mega foundation, you have to go to number 83 on my list. So there are 82 foundations in 2013, there'd be more now, that had net assets of $1 billion or more. It's a really staggering number. When I last looked at sort of a decade ago, there were 5 American foundations with net assets of $1 billion or more. And so the emergence of the mega foundation is really a huge factor in American life now. And these foundations are different in many ways. To name only one, almost every mega foundation has a living donor. The Ford Foundation does not, obviously, but almost all of them are relatively new foundations, created in the last 10 years or so, and it's in effect new money, and that's why they have been so recently created. Now there are many other things that have changed in this and few foundations have changed as much as the Ford Foundation. So it's a great opportunity to talk about that. So I'm going to simply lob a few questions out for Darren to get started with, and then we will open it up to all of you after we speak for a while. The first question is this, Darren. The language of philanthropy has changed enormously in the recent past, I would say particularly the last 20 years. And so if I thought of the adjectives that characterize the way in which philanthropy is described now, a few words would come to mind. Strategic would be one. Effective would be another. Venture would be another. These are all business terms that are now being applied to the way we think about the enterprise of philanthropy. I'm just wondering what your take is on this kind of language and on these newer approaches to thinking about how we ought to assess success in philanthropy.
Thank you, and it's great, a huge honor to be here with all of you. This is a remarkable program here at Princeton, and I've worked with many graduates of the Woodrow Wilson School, and they're just remarkable people. And so you all are following in the line of standing on the shoulders of some remarkable people working in development around the world. So it's a great honor for me to be here. I would say that I'm actually quite troubled by the idea of appropriating business practices for development and philanthropy. Not because I don't believe in rigor, because I do, but because in fact I spent a decade in business and in the private sector, and some of the most poorly run, inefficient experiences with enterprises I ever had were in those years. So I don't make the assumption that just because something is done in a particular way in business that it's better. Having said that, I do think that we have needed and we continue to need to have rigor and discipline in our work. But I think it runs the risk of containing and constraining the very thing that philanthropy is supposed to be about, which is about innovation and ideas and taking risk that often others, and particularly the private sector, aren't prepared to take. Philanthropy is our society's risk capital, and if you look back over certainly the 20th century in America and in the world, the story of philanthropy is the story of human achievement. Practically every significant advancement had attached to it, had invested in it, philanthropy. So my worry is that in appropriating these ideas that are based on business theory for philanthropy, that we may overcorrect. And I think in some ways we have overcorrected, because I think we today as a society have so adopted, I think, market-based ideas for our everyday lives that it appears that if something can't be measured, it doesn't matter. And I think that's a danger in a democracy.
Sure. But if I ask the obvious question to that, and then what's the measure then for an institution like the Ford Foundation of success? How do you know when an investment has succeeded?
Well, I think it depends. And so this is the really hard thing when you take. So I worked at a big global bank, and we peddled products to clients. We peddled CMOs, collateralized mortgage obligations. We sold all sorts of financial products. There were very clear metrics on a daily basis of what my success looked like. And every February, it in a very concrete way was presented to me. And so if I take that and I say, let me use those same metrics on a racial justice program. So the Ford Foundation has a racial justice program. We've been at it since 1968. I think that it's quite possible that along the way, we could be deemed a failure, because by many measurements, racial justice has not improved in America during the time we've spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's quite possible that someone could say, shame on you. You've wasted hundreds of millions of dollars. And your eminent professor, Peter Singer, might say that. Because quite frankly, we could have spent those hundreds of millions of dollars on vaccines. And in a very concrete way, might have made a different kind of impact. And yet, as a philanthropy committed to social justice in our society, we are compelled to work on racial justice.
Sure. But let me push you just a little on that. I certainly agree with you, but what is it that you sort of see out there, you see in the history of Ford's investment in racial justice, that gives you some confidence that this is an investment worth making, even though, as you say, we all know there are still serious problems? What do you say to your board to justify going forward with a program like that?
So I think it's important. That's a great question, and I don't mean to in any way be cavalier about this. I think this is a core, huge issue at a time of constrained resources to say, how are you responsibly deploying these resources that quite frankly have been made possible through public policy and a policy that gives a benefit to a wealthy donor like the Ford family. So I think that if a strategy is to alleviate poverty, for example, as we started in the 1960s, and this is really important because I've been in settings like this and people have said, poverty is just as bad as it was when you started. So basically you failed. In America, the poverty rate today is basically almost what it was in the late 60s. Now, during those years, poverty actually was cut in half. In 10 years, the poverty rate in America was cut in half. The poverty rate in America in 1965 was almost 18%. And by 1976, it was 8.5%. And we could look across any number of indicators of social progress for the most vulnerable in our society, and we saw meaningful progress. We saw employment rates for the most vulnerable among us in the labor market, Black urban men, reach levels of employment that were unprecedented. We saw that during the Clinton years. We had in the economy real challenges because there was not enough elasticity. People literally were employed at a level where by finding, I'm just using that population, African American men, we were employed at a pretty high level. Now it is true that today those data are pretty discouraging, but it is not true to say that we, in these intervening years, made no progress, that we did not achieve anything, and that it is simply not worth investing in. Because we know the data are very clear that we did make progress. We we have gone in a different direction, and I would say there are reasons why, but it's just not a fact to say that there has been no progress. And so we should be clear about what has worked and to say, how do we invest in that more?
Sure.
But we also, when you work on things like racial justice, and I'll get off of that, but because we started there, and because it is so hard from the standpoint of metrics, in a democracy, like the American democracy, we can't ignore that, because going back to your earlier question, the great American philanthropists always asked, what are the root causes in our society of our problems? And it is an incontrovertible fact that in American society, race remains a barrier for many advancement. And so it's a root cause issue.
Sure.
And to ignore it is ignoring at your own peril.
Well, you're talking my language now, and I think that this heads in the direction I was headed. The question then is, and this is absolutely true, that it was before Mr. Ford, but Mr. Rockefeller and Mr. Carnegie were the ones who came up with the notion that the principal task of philanthropy, as opposed to charity, was to identify the root causes of the primary ills in the society. Ford certainly is in that tradition. The primary mechanism they used, and Ford used, in order to ask that question and to try to solve that question, was by investing in research.
Absolutely.
Whereas most of the foundations we're talking about now aren't so keen, particularly in investing in university research. I'm just wondering at Ford how you feel about that now. Overwhelmingly, it was a research foundation.
Absolutely. So we certainly were a research foundation primarily until the late 60s and early 70s, in part because there were so many discoveries that were needed, and because knowledge was so weak in so many areas, and our depth of understanding. So the program that Ford supported that gave me my start, Head Start, when Ford funded the group of Yale social scientists in the early 60s, there was not much research. There was very little data on how you actually improved life outcomes for poor kids like me. And so we invested heavily in that agenda. There was very little data around how you helped the urban poor. I mean, we could go across so many areas where new disciplines and new discoveries were made as a result of the investment of many, many philanthropies. I would say that today, part of the reason that there is less enthusiasm at places like Ford for sort of research, qua research, is because in so many of the areas where we work, there is deep knowledge and evidence of what works. The question is, do we have the will to actually do it? And so we have certainly pivoted from saying, for example, in our education program, we need to fund another MDRC, randomized controlled trial on poor inner city children, ages K through 6. I mean,
Need to fund CC's research.
It is a very important, and there continues to be the need to build new knowledge, but there is sufficient knowledge to have directionally a sense of what works and what doesn't work. And so, again, I just spoke at the 50th anniversary of Head Start 2 weeks ago, and to my mind, Head Start still needs work. I mean, Head Start is not a perfect program, and there is the evidence around Head Start has been mixed.
Absolutely.
And so my
Particularly
view
the
on
longitudinal
it,
evidence.
exactly. So my view on it is we need to continue to do longitudinal work to improve it and to make it better, not to end it,
Right.
not to say, so you see, there's really nothing we can do for these poor kids. We need to just defund this work and take our attention to other.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think that's really important. So then let me ask the question, you know, if as the president of the Ford Foundation you have that kind of perception, I think it's a very important one, what does that say to you about how the foundation ought to be configured in order to pivot to a foundation that is more interested in implementing what we actually know about society than producing the initial research results?
I think it's why we have, and certainly with criticism from some corners, we have become more focused on policy change and advocacy, because we believe that the public needs to know what works and needs to be educated so the public can advocate for those changes that work in their lives, and particularly people who are often left out and left behind in our society. And so we have, we fund a lot of community organizing now, which is not something that is a favorite of large foundations generally. But we do because we believe the voices and the participation of people whose lives are affected, we need to support that in our society.
Well, the Ford Foundation got into a lot of trouble doing that in the 1960s, right? So
We did
how was
indeed.
your approach
Oh,
different
you're going
now?
to go there, Stan. Okay, so let me just say, the Ford Foundation in the 60s, we did a lot of things that I would call imprudent. And so, as I reminded the staff recently, because I think sometimes people have been very sort of defensive at the foundation about our history. I think our history is absolutely fascinating and is like the history of any great institution. It is filled with absolute inept blunders and soaring moments of inspiration and transformation. And in the 60s, certainly, I think, as you know, Henry Ford II, who was the chair of our board, over that period and into the 70s became quite displeased, I'll put it gently, with the direction of the foundation. And certainly after the grant making that we did that led to the regulation of philanthropy, the 1969 Act of Congress to regulate philanthropy, much of that was a direct result of the Ford Foundation.
Lots of people called it the McGeorge Mundy Act.
Indeed. Our president at that time was certainly a colorful character who had a very clear view of himself.
He was, by the way, the person who got me into this field. And it's interesting, by the way, when Mary Carl and I first applied to the Ford Foundation for a grant to write the history of philanthropy, our proposal was to write a book on big philanthropy and public policy. And the response from the staff was, the foundation was interested in the history of big philanthropy, but the foundation wasn't interested in public policy. It was 1974. So things have changed over that period of time. But I mean, really is an interesting, the direction things are going now. And I do remind, let's talk about this part of it though. Ford was interested in communities, but was always interested in the rest of the world. Some of our colleagues here work for Ford in other parts of the world. How has Ford changed as what I would call a global foundation? You were always international.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's important to understand a little bit of Ford's history because it's partly why we are who we are today. I mean, the Ford Foundation was actually chartered by Edsel Ford, Henry's son. Henry Ford, to say the least, was a conservative man. And
He said, by the way, the best philanthropy is giving a working man an honest day's wage.
exactly right.
So,
Henry Ford, I often, because I find myself on occasion defending Henry Ford, had a very strong point of view about what he could do. And in fact, today, you find many business leaders who really, they don't cite Henry Ford, but it's basically a repackaging of what he said,
That's
which
right.
is, I'm going to create a middle class. And he said, the best thing I can do is build an automobile that the production of which creates and transforms a middle class in the United States. And he did. And so I'm very proud of that. He also had very strong points of view about blacks and Jews and women and et cetera. And
he also said you can have a car any color you want so long as it's black.
that's right. That's exactly right. It was because for him it was about efficiency.
Right.
And the idea of introducing colors made it less efficient to produce cars. So when Henry Ford II, Edsel's son, who after Edsel's untimely death in 1943 inherited basically the post of chairman of the foundation and chairman of the company, the Ford Foundation inherited basically 90% of Edsel's Ford Motor Company privately held stock. And his son, Henry, realizing that the company was going public soon, realized that the Ford Foundation was going to be a very rich institution.
Right.
At which point he planned to move the foundation from Detroit, from Dearborn actually, to New York, which
Right.
he did. And he hired the best architect because he wanted a grand building, and he put together a commission of all the great social scientists of the day and eminent persons, and created the modern Ford Foundation that from the beginning was both an independent foundation, it was never a family foundation, and it was always from that point an international foundation.
Right.
And I'm often challenged when people say, you know, why does the Ford Foundation over in India and China when we've got all these problems here in America? Well, it's in part because our donor was very clear that we would be an international foundation. And in fact, we believe that that's been a good thing. Today, though, it has changed significantly. And I think we, like many legacy American institutions, are challenged with a new reality. The days of rich, important American institutions sort of dictating national policy in other countries and regions is over. I mean, we don't want or need to wield that kind of power. In fact, because in some ways what we've worked for, which is to empower local regions and countries, has happened. And so we have to be more humble. We have to listen more. We have to engage and develop solutions with people closest to the problems. And that's a very different way of operating than we did, say, in 1960, where there are letters in our archives of Mac Bundy, telling heads of state, you do this, you do that, and that was a very typical thing for a rich American institution in the 1960s to do. Because in the world, we were that kind of a power.
Sure.
But it's not that way anymore, and I'm not sure that's a bad thing.
No, it's certainly not a bad thing. But what's the conception, though? I mean, if you think of Ford as a global foundation, and if you think of it as a non-imperialistic foundation, to be sure, you want to be responsive to some extent, but I don't think your strategy is to send people around the world to ask them what needs to be done.
No, I think our strategy is to send people around the world, and in fact, our strategy isn't to send people around the world anymore. Our strategy is to empower people locally to articulate their own priorities, resources for those priorities, and to really execute on those priorities. And that's a fundamental difference. So if you were to look at the Ford Foundation's international staff 20 years ago, it would have been mostly American and European
No,
in
that's right.
all of the world.
Right.
Which was a very colonial model. I mean, again, looking back in our archives, there was great fear of what would happen if you actually let Africans run those Africa offices. And if you actually gave them the money to prioritize their own needs. So our goal today is to ensure that local capacity is built, because it's true, you just don't give people money. I mean, but that through education, through development work, through human rights work, through connecting the local with the global, that over time, our mission, promoting democratic values, peace and prosperity, that actually happens. Now, it's true, it's really hard to do that. We worked since 1953 in South Africa. Our first grant in South Africa was in 1953, and it was it was a research project because the government there had just promulgated the whole architecture of apartheid,
Right.
and no one in the world even knew what was going on. So we started a grant-making program. Well, that all culminated with Mandela's release because Ford had been so intimately involved in all of that and leading up to his release, et cetera. And so one could say that it was a success, and that by empowering Black South Africans and others aligned with them, that we were moving our mission of promoting democratic values. Now, one who knows the current context in South Africa would also ask the question, were we successful?
Yep.
Because I don't think that what we see in South Africa today is what Mandela or Oliver Tambo or any of the people whose work we supported envisioned. So there's work to do in South Africa, just as there's work to do in America.
Exactly. We don't. On that though, I mean, I remember it very well because my friend John Gerhardt, who was your
course.
first office head in Johannesburg, the first Ford office, that was in the early '80s, I think.
It was. Thank you. It
Later
was
than that?
90. It was the year of Mandela was released. The next year.
Okay. Well, and the strategy then was building civil society,
Absolutely.
and of course you ran into a problem because all the people you helped run civil society organizations went into
Which
the
was
ANC government.
Exactly. I mean, but again,
Can
that
only
was
be short.
the idea of civil society at the core of our strategy. The whole theory was to promote democracy, you have to have a healthy civil society. You have to have a vibrant civil society that contributes to constitutionalism, to the public interest. And it was a challenge because many of those people we supported, you're right, I mean, went into the ANC and went into government, which has not always made us happy.
Okay, good. Okay, well, I'm going to ask you one final question, then we'll open it up to the group, and it's really this: given what's happened to the foundation in terms of growth in your own resources, because $12 billion is not chopped liver; it's a lot of money, and it's a lot of responsibility. On the other hand, there are a great number of other foundations that are very large, although almost entirely not as large as yours. There are a great many more international organizations working on the kinds of problems that you're interested in, as opposed to 50 years ago, the international environment for the foundation. Everything has changed. I'm just wondering if you have a take on what it means to manage a foundation of this size, in the year 2015, in this environment. It's a tough environment, I think.
Well, it is a tough environment, but first of all, I think the idea that there is so much new philanthropy, we really celebrate. I mean, I look forward to the day when the Ford Foundation isn't in the top 10, because that's going to mean that there's all this new money that is being invested in change. Now, I hope that a lot of that new philanthropy actually embraces the idea of social justice and not funding primarily projects. And there's nothing wrong with projects. We need funders for projects. But if we don't have philanthropy pushing, asking about systems and asking about structures in a society, ultimately it's hard to imagine how we sustain real fundamental change. I think managing a global organization for any CEO today is a completely different paradigm than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And Ford is no different than any. There's a level of complexity both in the program work and in the operational work, things that we didn't think about in the past with any seriousness, like security, taking American privilege for granted, we simply no longer can do. And so we were just finishing a training of our staff in the Nairobi office on terrorism and on their own safety and security for them and their families. We never did training for the staff. And these aren't, and so the the Kenya office is staffed by all Kenyans and Ugandans. And there's one program officer from Latin America who is there. But, it's not like the old days when, the officers were, at least the professional staff, were Americans and Europeans, and sort of the idea of security you really worried about because we had to get out if there was an issue. These are today locals, and dealing with Al-Shabaab or dealing, there are just so many things that we just never thought about. And so managing that for me is a much more complex, and on any given day, there's always flare-ups. We have a situation in India that is very regrettable because a grantee has come under scrutiny, a former grantee has come under scrutiny, and it has led to very unkind things being said about the Ford Foundation seeking to...
The India Times was not happy about you last week.
No, because they accuse us of promoting communal disharmony.
Yeah.
Because our grantee challenged the government, and it became known that we were a large funder of this organization. And so things like that happen. Things like that happen when your grantees at the Human Rights Commission in Kenya challenged the president to bring him to before the ICC. You hear about it.
No, I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do. Well, the only other question I'll ask you about that, though, is if I look at the list of the largest foundations, American foundations, acting internationally, taking very seriously what you just said, I don't think I see a lot of foundations, a large number of them I would identify as social justice foundations. And I'm wondering whether there's a special obligation for Ford to find a way to hold up that flag and to represent internationally and globally that aspiration in American philanthropy.
Well, I think the larger issue is that the very idea of social justice is a contested idea. And which is interesting because for we Christians, this is a part of our religious tradition. The idea of social justice wasn't made up by some left-wing, Saul Alinsky. This was something that is in the scriptures, social justice. And yet today, I literally have had two of my foundation president colleagues tell me that I had to expunge from a document that we were working on for a project together the term social justice because their board would not look favorably upon it. I had a communications expert say to me, you gotta like drop all that social justice language because it's a turnoff. It feels 60s. You're gonna, if you want to get other donors to co-fund with you your work, you need to just change your language. And so I think very seriously about this issue of language, because language does matter. But then I come back to, you know, we live in a society where increasingly, and again, I'm not holding Ford up as some model of purity around these issues at all, but I despair over the fact that first it's contested, but secondly, where are the voices? I mean, for this. I mean,
Exactly.
I had a meeting with the president of a major university. You would all know if I said the name, and the president said they just read a speech that I gave, and it was about social justice, and they said, I really loved what you said about the social justice, and I think what you said is so. And I said, thank you. And I said, you know, there was a time when university presidents used to talk about justice and injustice in society, and their response was just amazing. They said, we can't do that anymore. We're fundraisers now, and we can't afford to offend our trustees. And the very people, the very concern, because in this speech I talked about inequality and how insidious it was in terms of our democracy and the idea of hope, because hope is at the center of our democracy, and inequality eats away at hope anyway. And they said, you know, I couldn't give that speech because, you know, my trustees would have my head, because I've got a capital campaign to get ready for, and I've got to go to some of those billionaires. Those are my naming opportunities, and I can't give that speech. And so it struck me as both honest, so honest,
And
but
depressing.
also so depressing, because in a democracy, we have to have privileged people and privileged institutions. And there is no more privileged institution in our democracy than big, rich private universities and big, rich private foundations, who should be saying, and again, not from a sense of arrogance or, oh, we are the purveyors and determinants of who's right and wrong in society, but that they're just, you're speaking truth. I mean, you're speaking your own perspective on truth, and there's less of that, and that really worries me. And so that's why I recoil at the idea of saying, let's just give up that language, and it'll make people happier. It'll make us have more friends, and it'll make us have more partners, because I think that part of our job is to be uncomfortable with our comfort.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to be more prudent than I normally am and just say amen to that.
It's not that it's about agreeing, that it's about saying that, because my colleagues at the foundation often accuse me of being the most conservative person at Ford. So I'm often, it's not that, it's about agreeing or support. It's about just wanting to be in a society where those voices and those messages are heard from a lot of different places,
Sure.
not just from 2 or 3, or not just the usual suspects.
I mean, I'll say only that I think it's enormously important for you to keep saying what you're saying, because we don't have very many, it's not just university presidents, we don't have very many foundation presidents saying it. So I hope you're going to stick to that particular speech. It's important.
Fortunately, like any president who hopefully is doing his or her job, my board, I think, is very supportive of the direction, and staying the course.
Okay, so we've been doing the talking, or I've been doing a little bit of talking, so I want to open it up now for questions. We have about 20 minutes, and I'd like, if there's a student who has a question first, I'd like to recognize a student.
Hi, my name is Juliet Levine, and I'm a senior in the Woodrow Wilson School. And I wrote my thesis on the lack of information on charities as a barrier to effective individual giving. So I'm wondering why the Ford Foundation is reluctant to sort of transparently share more about the research and decision making that could maybe empower individual donors to have more knowledge.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I think it's absolutely true that we in philanthropy have not been nearly as transparent as we need to be. And I've talked about that a great deal. If you read any of the things of my posts, I talk about that. And I talk about my own experience. My first month on the job, my communications director came to see me about a number of things. And at the last item was just an FYI to me that the Chronicle of Philanthropy had called, as they do every year, and asked for my compensation for their survey. And as we do every year, he just said, FYI, we don't give them that. And he sort of said it as an FYI. And I said, why don't we give it to them? And he said, because we never have given it to them. I said, well, but we know it. And he said, well, because it's just policy. We don't give that kind of information. They can go on the 990 when the accountants file it, and they can go and get it then, but that's not for another a year. And I said, well, that's just ridiculous. Why wouldn't we? And so it was. I literally wrote a post because it was such a moment of inflection for me, because it so spoke to just the broader culture. And so we now are in a process of becoming more transparent. Not to have to get you in the minutia of what we're going through at Ford, but I have this sort of 5-year vision, and there are 3 parts of it. And the first part that I think I want to focus on most, which is not is culture. Because most leaders focus on strategy, which is great because strategy is exciting, it's sexy, it's stimulating, you're thinking a lot, you can conceptualize. It always is in a PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint is very linear, and you click, and at the end it's like impact. And so it just all is so compelling, and so you really want to get to that. But actually, and because I've been through enough change processes in myself, I know that that's what we all want to get to. But I've also learned that without paying attention to the platform for execution, which is the organization's culture, you really, no matter how beautiful your PowerPoint is, you won't be successful. So I'm really spending a lot of time on what I call fostering a culture of transparency. And there are a number of parts of that. And one part of that is sharing more information about our grant making process, opening up we're going to do in 2016 our first foundation-wide RFP, because one of the things I've learned through a lot of inquiry with grantees and with others is that people perceive the foundation to be opaque, top-down, very difficult to get a grant if you don't know somebody, et cetera, et cetera. So there are ways in which we're going to address this. It won't be perfect, but I think we are aiming to be more transparent.
Great, good answer. Janie.
My name is Janie. I'm also a senior in the Woodrow Wilson School. I wrote my thesis on one of the Ford programs in criminal justice, and I'm curious to know
And it's a good thesis.
I'm curious to know, is there a way to sell social justice in this landscape without making, or going towards these business metrics that you try to strive away from, or without selling it as kind of like a neoliberal program? I had a program officer tell me he didn't ever use the words criminal justice. He used community renewal so that people could focus on taxpayer dollars that were saved as opposed to the vulnerable populations.
Yes. And I think, so there's been a movement on the part of many progressives that I think reflects a lot of data about the perceptions of Americans about our problems in society, and particularly the poor, and public expenditures. And so what you are hearing is a reflection of programs that have been crafted in response to some of that data. So while it is, to me, very disheartening to not be able to say, we have a problem with our criminal justice system, that is because we have a biased criminal justice system. I mean, can we just say that? Well, actually, generally, Americans don't want to hear that. And to say that to them and expect that will evoke an agreement and then a yes, we should invest in fixing that bias system doesn't work. It just doesn't, and we know that. And so, in its place, are new constructs like we need to renew communities, and we'll renew communities by making it possible for those residents of those communities to have education. And if some of those residents happen to be in prisons, we need to renew the community, and they need to be a part of that. And so it's a different way of framing the issue, because if you simply say, we have a biased criminal justice system, and the reason that so many of them are in prison is because they're primarily poor and black and brown, that the American people actually generally, that's not an approach that will have a response, an affirmative response of, so we need to invest in fixing that. And so that's a challenge, and one can lament it and say, or one can say, we got to figure out how to make it work. And that's how you make it work.
Great. Okay. Yes, Julia.
So I love what you said about social justice.
Tell us who you are,
Oh,
Julia.
sorry, I'm Julia Rubin, and I teach here on a periodic basis. So I'm a professor of Rutgers and sometimes here. And I love what you said about social justice. And I loved your story about the university president. And Stan obviously writes about some of the issues that I'm going to touch on. But Robert Reich wrote a very good piece about how nonprofits aren't speaking up anymore because they're too busy fundraising from the same people that they used to criticize, right? So the elephant in the room is growing income inequality.
Oh my God.
And beyond the funding of ways to address the growing income inequality at a policy level, I'm wondering if all those billion-plus foundations aren't part of the problem, right? So all that tax money that's not in the coffers and can't fund the organizations that now have to go to the corporations and wealthy individuals for that money. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir, I realize. So beyond the policy advocacy to try to address the income inequality, what about the untouchable, which is the regulatory environment around foundations? Because when you're sitting on a big pot of money, no one can touch you, right? And as foundations become more and more reflection of that inequality.
Absolutely. Great question. So I think that the tension that certainly I live with on a daily basis is palpable on this issue. On the one hand, I mean, I certainly, by any means, would be understood not to have come from a privileged background. And that makes me so much more conscious every day. So just me, Darren Walker, plain old Darren Walker, would feel really privileged when I look at my male cousins, over half of whom have been in prison or died in prison in the case of one, and I see my life, I would, of course I'm privileged. Now, Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation, is really privileged. And that tension that you speak of leading a rich, large, influential organization that has an endowment of almost $13 billion that is invested in all sorts of things, creates levels of complexity and tension. And what I will tell you is that, one, even if tomorrow every foundation in America was closed down and the money transferred to the public treasury, it would be a rounding error in 1 year's federal budget of the United States government. And so I don't see the solution to end the charitable deduction policy that makes it possible for wealthy Americans to create foundations. Having said that, I think there are lots of ways in which conversations are had about what's the best way to incent the kind of philanthropy that helps to build our democracy and strengthen our society. And going back to Peter's, once again, you can hold up Peter's book. There are certainly people who advocate for a particular kind of philanthropy, who would say, we need to, if you aren't willing to give your money to these things, then you shouldn't get a tax deduction. I'm not a proponent of that, because I think what is so amazing about American philanthropy is the diversity of American philanthropy. I think you are right. I think your concern that a billionaire who wants to give their money to create a museum in their name and buy art, that they can do that.
Or take care of her dog.
Or take care of the dog. Although the judge said you couldn't really take care of the dog. I mean, leave the dog a trust. But I mean, that's another whole thing with the Helmsley Trust. But on this point, I think that I am reluctant to encourage us to think about ways that inhibit American philanthropy, and to I would not be willing to say that if a wealthy donor wishes to create an art museum through their charitable foundation, that should not be treated as philanthropy. I'm not willing to say that I'm not willing to support that. I don't support that. I actually wish more of them would say, I want to do social justice work, but I don't think that should be mandated. And I don't think that as a policy we should create hierarchies of human need in philanthropy and prioritize those things that are on the kind of scale of human needs.
Good. Okay. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Dan Wick. I'm a first-year MPA student here. We recently had a group who got together to talk with the person who wrote the New Yorker article about Mark Zuckerberg's gift to Newark. And I'm curious kind of what you think of that kind of high-profile donation as a strategy in philanthropy. Obviously, it was widely criticized as far as its impact on the community. But I'm curious kind of what you think about it and kind of how you think something like that could have gone different and what the Ford Foundation kind of thinks about it.
Well, I think that I commend Mark Zuckerberg and my friend Cory Booker, who I've known for a long time, and I think all good intentions. I think there are two things that make new philanthropy, some of the new megas that you're talking about, and the legacies a little different. One is new philanthropy is incredibly impatient, and it's because often their money has been made in a really narrow period of time. And so it's easy to understand why they would experience things in an accelerated pace. In terms of their own success, they have and they do. And so often, again, that gets transmitted to a context where you find some philanthropists making really, I'll say, sort of views that are really not based on a reality of the way people live their lives. And so in the case of the Newark schools, I think it's impossible to think about transforming a school system like Newark without saying this is going to be a lifetime commitment. The reasons the schools are so challenged are complex and multi-layered. And if we want to actually fix that, we can develop metrics and but please don't go into that expecting that in 3 years you're going to see marked improvement. That's one. And the second is you have to figure out a way to bring authenticity to the endeavor. And if it is perceived as something that is being imposed, it simply won't succeed. I mean, that's one of the things we know. When I was saying earlier about we know enough about from evidence, one of the things we know from the evidence is that if poor people, if poor communities, and I don't care where it is, we have just seen it with the Millennium Villages in Africa. It doesn't matter where, if people in communities don't have ownership of the change that outsiders are envisioning, it's not going to happen. I don't care how much money you put into it. And I think, you know, the context in Newark for building consensus is a really challenging context. And so be smart. Understand that before you engage, that you're giving money to in a context. And so you have to work at that part of it, because without doing that, you're not going to get, your goal's just not going to be met. And that's often the mismatch of some of the new donors, and not just new, we experienced that. And so what I regret is that there was so much attention given to that effort, and the headline was failure, because it sours other donors who would look at school systems in poor urban areas and say, I want to help. Because then they say, but look at what happened to Mark Zuckerberg. And that's, I deeply regret that.
My name's Hannah Cumming, and I'm also a senior in the Woodrow Wilson School. You talked about your focus on social justice, and we've kind of been talking about the American context, and social justice implying, of course, changing social norms, and you talked about changing these structures and systems. So my question is, how does that translate for international programs? Obviously, the development community has really shied away from Western development experts coming in and saying you need to change your culture or your social norms in these ways. Now we're talking about how offices are much more run by locals. So how does that change the approach to social justice in terms of those social norms?
Sure. Another great question. So we know that social norms and culture are so much a barrier or an accelerator. So I'll just take two programs that we, our work on child marriage and FGM, female genital mutilation. There is no outside parachuting in that's ever going to change child marriage or FGM, and we learned that. What we also learned was that by allowing local communities to engage in a culture change process where the established influentials in that community, whether it be a tribal leader or a Muslim cleric or the community elders, those are the people who are the culture carriers. Those are the people, not somebody from the World Bank or the Ford Foundation, who are going to embed and sustain change over the long haul. And so what we've learned, and in part it is because in our West Africa office, for example, it's they're all West Africans, and they understand. And so on these issues, our grants have been to support those kinds of activities, and we have seen real improvement in those areas. And so it's just taught us a lot about norms, and so we don't always. What we've learned is we don't always appropriate the exact practice from the U.S., but the idea of changing norms is absolutely universal. And we saw that in our work around LGBT in the U.S., where so much of the early work was early on about litigation and learning that no matter what victories came in the courts, if you didn't change people's perspectives that mainstreamed LGBT Americans, that didn't matter what you did in the courts. So that's why we funded things like in Hollywood, having script writers have storylines with gay characters, or using gay Americans, their voices on big important national issues. And so through those kinds of interventions, people over time, I think, and we don't claim credit for it, I think we and many others who were early funders in the LGBT rights movement in this country, though I think took a position that ultimately it was culture. And I think we see that no matter where we are in the world.
Great. Okay, we have time for one more. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Vladimir. I'm a third-year PhD student here. As a product of Head Start and a current Ford Fellow, I think I should start by saying thank you.
Yay, you're a Head Starting, yay, another Head Start.
Thanks for funding my research. I guess my question is about means and ends. So how should we reconcile the fact that a lot of the money that goes into funding these social justice efforts is sometimes made through means or through industries that sometimes contribute to a lot of the social ills, right? So bankers working on income inequality, or large food corporations donating to anti-obesity efforts. Is that something we should be concerned about, or?
It's something we should be very concerned about, and it's something that I am very concerned about. And it is, as I said earlier, about this notion of the tension that we have to live with. I mean, I'll give you an example. We're right now, working on some new programming areas, and one of the things we have is our economics program. And so we were in a meeting we have these meetings in a conference room where all my really smart colleagues get up and present and tell me things they're working on that they're excited about. And one person said, I think I want to do new work on alternatives to capitalism. And I thought, so I said it was, but what I really, the rationale that led her to assert this as a possible area of research and work and exploration was her dismay with many of the features of our system that so exclude and marginalize large swaths of our society. Now, I had to just sort of take a moment because it was, most of the senior people had sort of just remind people, we are capitalists at the Ford Foundation, and we actually believe in our system. We worry that not enough people are included in our system, and in any market economy where there is going to be some inequality, we also need to worry about those who are vulnerable and who don't succeed in our market economy. And so that tension of how do we recognize that at the same time we're supporting and investing, because we certainly are, in ways that may actually undermine or may contribute to the inequality. How do we reconcile that? And I'm not sure we do it successfully, but we are engaged in a conversation about that. And it's one of the things that is a conversation I'm having with my board now, which is good because I think a lot of boards don't have those kinds of conversations. And I don't have an answer that is dispositive to, okay, so tomorrow we're going to take all $12.5 billion and put it into green technology. No, we're not going to do that. But we are interested in how we think about our investments. And I think want to explore ways in which we can have a mechanism that reinforces our mission. And that also prudently ensures that we have capital for generations to come. It's an ongoing bit of tension that on a daily basis I deal with.
Great. It's a great answer. Well, I want to say that I've been watching the Ford Foundation for 40 years, as I said at the beginning, and I've really never felt better about the prospects for the foundation than I do right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You're very kind. Thank you. Thank you all.